Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tiberian Sun's review. I'm me, and he's him.
Hello.
So,
Blah, blah, blah.
dude, don't reference anime. That's for another review. So, we are going to be blah blah blahing for a bit. But this is a review for the second proper Tiberian game, since Red Alert was just a fucking expansion pack. Soviet reskin, if you will. And one of the things that I noticed about how Tiberian Sun exists as a game is this a very different experience than I was expecting. And it had a couple of mechanics and design directions that were very different from other RTS games that I had played, including ones that came after it, but of course ones that came before it as well. And so I figured we might be able to start our conversation about those specific elements that are different and unique to Tiberian Sun. Now, again, I haven't played every Command & Conquer game out there. I certainly haven't played Red Alert 2, and I haven't played the Generals games, but I've played most of them at this point. And so I can say with some surety that the terrain deformation as a mechanic was something that was rather unique, at least to this title. Like, I don't remember playing any RTS game that was released before or since that had terrain deformation as a mechanic, and at the very least, not to this extent, where your artillery and stuff are creating it, and eventually it stops you from being able to build structures in places, and of course it slows down movement speed and all this other stuff. And so I'm sure there's plenty more that you are familiar with or can rant about off the top of your head. But I figure what we could do is we could talk about some of the unique attributes of Tiberian Sun as an RTS. We can talk about what those mechanics are, what those design decisions are, and after we sort of identify them, after we identify them in sort of like a list or something like that, we can, I guess, objectively assess whether or not they were useful and contributed positively to the game overall. And I'm sure you guys can already figure out what I think about the terrain deformation, but other mechanics as well.
Yeah, I agree with this. But maybe the best way to start this review is by comparing it not so much to Red Alert 1, but to the very first game.
Right.
And we might as well start with the theme. So one thing that I find surprising, I guess, in reverse, as I actually played Tiberian Sun before I played the first game, which is the opposite for you. One thing that they changed is the overall theme. Whereas the first Command and Conquer game had like this real war aesthetic to it, I guess it had some sci-fi elements, of course, but it was generally grounded in real world geopolitics. Sort of, it had a fairly realistic theme. Like even in the cutscenes, the guys were using real world military uniforms and whatnot. Whereas in this sequel, they completely changed the theme. They went from a pseudo-realistic theme to a post-apocalyptic one. So everything looks very different. All the uniforms are different. All the terrain is very different. It now looks like a really decaying planet full of deserts and strange alien life forms. So I think that's a bit of a culture shock, I guess, going from the first Command and Conquer game but to an extension to the one as well, which was thematically very, very similar to this title. They definitely changed the direction quite a bit, which I actually found surprising. As like, if you were to judge the two games side by side, maybe if it wasn't for the interface, you would probably think they have nothing in common. And but moving on to the actual mechanics, they actually completely rewrote the engine, the way it works. It's no longer 2D, but it's now somewhat like 2.5D, I guess you could say. It has an isometric view now. So even the way the units move and the buildings are placed are different, as now everything is seen from an angle. And I will say the engine improvements have been very significant compared to the first two titles, which makes sense considering how old those were.
Yeah.
The pathfinding is really improved. The commands are also way more functional, although we probably still missed a few of them, and some we didn't discover until like the end of the playthrough.
Yeah, shout out to Daniel Keaton, because without him, man, we wouldn't have even been able to A move or anything or set rallies. We needed a manual. We needed a fucking manual, dude.
So I guess comparing it to the first game, the terrain deformation obviously is something that's completely unique to this title, whereas The first game used to have crater graphics basically for damaged terrain, but it was just a visual effect. And I think this game also has them, but as the terrain deformation that you mentioned, which of course doesn't really work that well. It's an interesting experiment, but I can see why they dropped that in the future titles.
Right.
And it also has some other aspects, like for example, there's the fact that units tend to respond differently from in the terrain itself. Like some units don't work very well on multiple elevations, like for example the railgun units, such as the railgun commando, and also the disc throwers. The disc throwers work very differently depending on which angle they fire from, and which actually is interesting, especially when you compare it to StarCraft 2 and Warcraft 3, which are technically supposed to be 3D engines, but they do not feature such terrain impact mechanics.
Yeah, there's really no sort of terrain obstacles or serving as obstacles in any of these RTSs that actually have, you'd think, more engine capabilities for something like that. I wonder if that's because they thought that they didn't need it, like maybe they just didn't consider it at the time. But actually, I think it does add a healthy amount of positional gameplay to Tiberian Sun's engagements. And even if it's kind of difficult to spend the APM to make sure that you're making proper usage out of that, especially when you have to kind of micromanage your walkers, as we found out eventually there is like a fire on the move mechanic for a lot of these units. If you have to micromanage your Titans or whatever your main force actually is in the middle of battle, you're probably not going to be able to set up your hoop throwers so that they can actually throw their hoops at the right angle, or the rail gunners or whatever. Like just moving them around and then telling them to attack afterwards is going to be a bit of APM that you probably won't even have necessarily, at least if you're as bad as me. So I'm not sure how well it worked out in the final run, but I would say that one of the things that I can comfortably say coming away from that is that that's a good concept. Like conceptually, having terrain actually interact with the missiles, with the projectiles, is, I think, a good concept. And having more interactivity with missiles, different ways to avoid and dish out more damage, or extend the range of a unit in ways that otherwise wouldn't be possible, or just extend the utility of a unit based around terrain. I feel like that is a good way to do it. And like that's one way to add positional gameplay. That's one way to add skill expression to a game. It's just that with the scale that I'd like to play at, you probably wouldn't be able to see those kinds of micro fights, at the very least at my skill level. And so that would actually be a way to incentivize players to get better at the game. And I think because then you can see ways to improve your turnout. The victory or defeat can completely change depending on how well you micro your units in that sense. And it's almost StarCraft-esque in that way, where tiny little adjustments can actually lead to huge gains that could turn the tide of an entire fight. Although, of course, I'm speaking from a complete position of ignorance. I have no idea what the multiplayer of this game looks like, and I've never played a multiplayer match of it in my life, so I couldn't tell you.
Well, I think this is also one area where the game is actually fairly innovative, and that not many games before this have tried to employ terrain in such a way. The only one I can think of is Dark Reign, which came out, I think, a year before, but it definitely looked way less advanced than this. It was still using 2D graphics, so it didn't really give the same sense of scale and perspective that this title has. And moving on to the list of new features, one thing that the game also did differently than from other games of the time is the fact that they tried to create a little more of a dynamic environment. So you have, for example, the various Tiberium life forms. So Tiberium is no longer just a resource you harvest, but it's also something that creates mutants that has oftentimes alien creatures guarding it, which are generally hostile to both you and your enemies. And it also has, for example, the venal monsters, which is those tentacle monsters that serves both as an obstacle but also as a resource, strangely enough. And I think this is a new concept, like the idea of making the game world a little more dynamic, a little more responsive to the player units, basically, instead of just resources sitting there and doing and not doing anything beyond just providing resources. So that's another thing that is new, I think, in the game, especially compared to the first title as well, which didn't really do this.
Yeah, there's
So
definitely a lot more going on the map that has nothing to do with you or your direct opponents, right? There's world events and elements of the environment that really come to life in a different way than I've seen in most other RTS titles. I think the closest allegory that pops into my head, and maybe this is just my own bias from the games that I've played, is the creep camps in Warcraft 3, but these are just static elements, and they don't really thematically engage with you in any way.
yeah,
Obviously, you have to go fight them for experience, and say what you will about the execution of that, but just thematically speaking, just taking gold from creeps or whatever isn't really the same thing as destroying a Tiberium life form and having it spawn the resources at its corpse and allowing you to go then and benefit from that by harvesting it. I think that's way cooler than something like just handing the player gold for free as soon as they kill the unit. Not really for free, but you know what I mean. It's much different. It's much more interactive, I think. So because you're forcing that kind of interaction, or not really forcing it, I guess it's just an element of the gameplay that feels very rooted in the theme. I feel like it's actually really good, and I'm really happy that they included something like that in there. That is, it ticks a lot of the right boxes for me. Like my concept of an environment in an RTS is that the environment should integrate itself with the mechanics in a foundational gameplay sense and connect back to the thematic of whatever the mechanics are sourced from in the first place. One of the reasons I think that Tiberian Sun and Command and Conquer as a whole, especially the Tiberian side of things, is so we can say it's well liked overall. I feel like that part of that is because of this game's consistency. I feel like, especially looking at where they took the third game, like this game is probably what got a lot of people hooked on the franchise overall, because it was still sort of realistic, as you mentioned in your opening comments, but not to the same degree that the first game was. So it had an element of fantasy in that sense, or science fiction at the very least. And the post-apocalyptic thing hadn't quite been done to death as it has now. At least in its current time period. So of course we're kind of projecting what we assume to be the standards of the time, or the zeitgeist of the time, and trying to reverse engineer how well the game may have done as a result of that. But I do feel like, it had a lot going for it thematically, and especially if you ignore Firestorm's 10-minute anime cutscenes, you just look at how the first game presented itself in terms of gameplay, especially if you didn't play with cutscenes, as you many times throughout the playthrough cited your own source was through a console instead, which didn't have them. I think you can take a lot away from just how the game presents itself from a thematic level. It's obvious that the missions themselves weren't very engaging from like a difficulty standpoint or a gameplay standpoint, but just looking at the environment, checking out how the environment comes to life in that sense, I feel like that is a positive thing that you can take away from this title, and certainly a concept that can be applied to many other franchises, many other titles, as far as them being an RTS is concerned.
Definitely. And they also try to sort of employ this mechanic into the missions themselves with mixed results. I would say for the most part it was not very successful. Whereas you have, for example, missions where the Tiberium life forms attack the civilians, or you have missions where actually attacking the civilians prompts an intervention from GDI. So they actually did try to sort of create a world where there's several different, even neutral factions, be it the Tiberium life forms or the civilians, where it feels like the scale is definitely bigger than just two factions fighting over supremacy. Whereas the civilians did exist in the previous titles, but they were just mostly for decoration. Like they didn't really play much of a part in any of the missions for the most part.
Hey, what are you talking about? In Red Alert 1, it ends with a bunch of civilians basically handing you the victory because Stalin fucking rolls in with his men or something. I don't even know.
That's actually one of the few exceptions, but
yeah, I know what you mean.
The fact that they actually tried to integrate this in the story, I think, is a nice idea. It feels like it's a little more like if you compare it with StarCraft, for example, where the Terrans do have civilians, but they're classified as a hero unit. They don't really have any buildings of their own. They just have map decoration that are supposed to be cities.
Yeah.
And the Protoss don't really have any civilians, for example. So I think it's definitely a different direction that they try to apply in this context. And I think it's a good concept.
Well, it's a little more intimate, right? Because you're looking at a game that's meant to be it's still on Earth, right? It's still homely in that sense, but it's Earth after a great catastrophe, a great cataclysmic event has happened and completely changed the landscape and completely changed how the powers that be work. And so you're just sort of buying into however realistic or unrealistic the franchise's factions feel based on the fact that, well, we're not really in a position where the modern US or the modern China or the modern superpowers could contend because of the cataclysm that happened. And so, like, it sort of allows you to, this is kind of an esoteric example, but in my own StarCraft campaigns, I start off the player by hooking them into, like, something that's around the corner of an existing lore event in the canon, and then saying, all right, now you understand where this takes place in the main story. Let's completely ignore the main story for the rest of the runtime of the campaign and all of the campaigns that come after it, because I'm writing my own story. It's sort of like they did that, but with Earth. They, like, said, here's roughly where we are. You can sort of date the time period of the game. If they didn't explicitly say where it was set, like, in the timeline, they at the very least do so sort of vaguely with technology. And they say, like, all right, now imagine alternate history. Like, we go into this area and this happens, and now we're going to write our own story. Like, they're sort of doing the same sort of concept in that sense. And so I feel like it does work out pretty well, and the environment reinforcing those thematics and those story elements, be it the civilians, be it the mutants, be it the Tiberian life forms, just how the game works out overall. The cyborgs as well had the similar death mechanic of spawning Tiberium and stuff. I feel like it really helped. It really came to life at the end of the day, and that was one of its defining moments. I think that defining elements rather that helped it set itself apart from other RTS titles, especially at the day where, like, at the time where nobody was really doing stuff like that.
Yeah, it was definitely innovative for the time. It was still the golden age of the genre, so to speak, before the advent of 3D graphics and the downfall of the genre with Warcraft 3. But it's also surprising that we actually haven't seen, I think, too many innovations even since then. Like, if you compare it to even modern RTS games that come out nowadays, like, for example, StarCraft 2, in the very last Protoss mission, it has the terrain destruction function, but it's just a trigger that removes part of the terrain. Like, it's not an organic mechanic, basically.
Well, I don't necessarily know that you need to innovate over the existing formula.
Oh, yeah, no.
But
it's definitely not necessary. Quality is the most important thing. It's just interesting that back then people tried to throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks, so to speak. Whereas nowadays they're way more, I guess, content with the formula that they have. Although, like we've seen with Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2, it's not necessarily the best formula.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the thing, though, isn't it? Because I feel like you can get into a conversation about modern RTS titles and how, like, back in the era of Tiberian Sun, developers were still trying to figure out what the formula would be, what a good method would be, what to stick to, and what doesn't work and what does work. And that's sort of one of the questions that we have to answer with this review, or one of the questions we seek to provide an answer to, is what worked and what didn't. But I do feel like most of the formula that is used by modern RTS titles doesn't work either. So it is definitely a tough question to answer in that context, is like, what lessons can we learn, or what lessons should we have learned from this title going forward into the future of the genre and the future of the industry. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about what made this game unique anyways, is because it sort of sets the pace for, like, I guess it gives you an idea of which mechanics could easily have been sort of abstracted away from Tiberian Sun and just applied to any other RTS with not really that much retrofitting in order to make it work properly in that context as well. And, like, I already gave the example of how Warcraft 3 just uses a cheap bounty system, and that doesn't reinforce any theme whatsoever. It's not like you have to go send a gold, or rather a harvester to harvest the gold, the same way that you have to harvest the Tiberium. So it's like a very different mechanic. It's an abstraction on the existing mechanic of harvesting resources, because you're doing it with units instead of with workers. So it's different in that respect, and it's not reinforcing any theme, like I keep saying. So it doesn't really feel like you're doing much besides, I mean, I guess people robbed other people in fantasy settings and stuff like that, but, like, people do that here too in modern day. People have done it in sci-fi. Obviously, we get pirates and bandits and whatever else. So it doesn't reinforce anything. Whereas in this game, very clearly there was some effort paid to, taking something that worked in the previous setting, which is their harvesting mechanic. Like, they were happy with that in some ways, harvesting just one resource and spending only one resource and having, like, time be the other resource, really. And then saying, okay, now what ways can we incorporate this into our setting? I don't really know if that was the exact thought process, but it did work out that way, and I'm pretty happy with it. Like I said, I think that's one of the strongest elements of the game, actually.
Yeah. And there's a bunch of other new introductions, again, tied to the game world and the environment and the destroyable terrain and such stuff like that. So basically, for example, another one is the destroyable bridges that you can repair and walk under, which sort of give a pseudo 3D perspective, which is amusing considering that is something that Warcraft 3 cannot actually do, for example. And they also have tunnels that you can navigate to get to the other side of a mountain. They also have trains. They have trains which follow a different. They follow a different movement system, so they can only function on the train tracks, and they can also go over specific bridges. So the trains sometimes actually show up in skirmish mode. We didn't get to see this, but there is a skirmish map where there's a neutral train that goes throughout several tunnels, and you can actually use it as a makeshift transport for your infantry. So that's an interesting concept again.
Yeah.
Something that feels, again, a little more organic, a little more built into the engine itself, into the levels themselves, instead of just being a one-off thing that you never see again.
Right. And they built on the terrain, I don't know if you would call it deformation exactly, but they built on terrain interactivity from the first game of having the bridges that you can repair with engineers and stuff by having, you know, I don't know if they did do this in this case, but they could have built upon it anyways with the trains. If you were able to destroy the train tracks and then repair those with an engineer, that would be something very similar, very copy and paste in that sense, given the mechanics, but still fitting with what you already are expecting from the franchise and still in line with the mechanics that you're using elsewhere in the game. So I think it makes sense that they would have more interactable elements in the environment. I feel like the more interactable elements you have, generally the more teetering your map is on gimmicky. And what it comes down to usually is how you use these elements. Because like I keep saying, you know, the elements themselves conceptually seem fine, but you have to use them in the right ways. Yep. And like we saw in one of the famous train missions that we played, I don't even remember if it was a vanilla game or if it was a Firestorm mission, but there was one mission where we had to chase a train down, and it wasn't a micro mission, but it was pretty fucking close. Like we really had to hunt it down in an exact QTE fashion, and since we couldn't do it, we just ended up skipping it. I don't know if you know which one I'm talking about.
Yeah, I remember which one it is. We probably just didn't really understand the poorly explained gameplay concept we were supposed to do, as that's really the main issue, I think, with the game, is that the micro maps, on top of being micro maps, were also very poorly explained. Like, many of them were not just, say, moving through crowds. Like, that's not what most of the micro missions were about.
No.
Some of them involved, like, infiltrating a base with spies. Another one involved, like you said, chasing down the train, and you're supposed to take different paths. But since you don't know, you have no way of knowing what's ahead of you. Clearly, some paths are better than others. So it just comes off like maybe you want to have that concept. You can have that concept even with base building. There's no reason why you cannot have base building and not chase down the train at the same time.
Well, that was a macro mission, but it was weird because they gave you artillery in that same mission, and artillery need to deploy and stay static in order to work. And so it's like, oh yeah, here's what I'm going to do in this mission where I get artillery, which kind of implies I'm supposed to siege, which takes time, or defend my base with artillery, which of course means that they're static and staying at home as static defense. Actually, I have to rush and kill a train. Like, what the fuck? Like, why is it's just a complete misdirection immediately? Which actually was very common in this day and age, and even earlier. Games often times tried to mislead you by giving you complete bullshit sort of direction. Something that comes to mind, which most people probably aren't familiar with, but there was a first-person RPG game called Enclave that I played back in like 2004. I think it was released on the original Xbox. And when there's this one mission where if you enter in the portal to go home, using the portal that you have always entered to end the level, every single level up until that point, it just kills you and you have to redo the entire level. What you actually have to do is go to a different portal that you've never gone in before, that you don't even know is a portal until you walk up to it, and it's never explained either. You just... So, yeah. Stuff like that. Like, that was actually very common in early games where they would just fuck you for no reason.
Yeah, it's the type of thing that seems to indicate lack of playtesting more than anything. Because if you are the one...
Well, it's very much intentional. Usually.
Like, if you are the one making a level, then you already know what all the tricks are going to be, where all the traps are going to be.
Yeah.
So, there's really not the same feedback that you would get if it was someone doing a blind playthrough, which is what we did in this case.
Yeah. Well, actually, to build upon that point, I think it's important to consider that when you make a level linear in that sense, and it can be open-ended in terms of how you explore certain elements of it, like it can be an open-ended macro mission or whatever, but if there's certain things that they're gotcha moments, right? You walk into an area and it's filled with traps. You walk into an area and it triggers the train. You walk into an area and something happens, and it's an invisible tripwire that you don't know exists until you do it. Like it's very much trial and error in terms of how to find a solution. And when you have something like that, it's necessarily going to be linear and lack replay value for all but a very select few people who are interested in speedrunning, which we cited a few times in the playthrough. Like, if you're not interested in speedrunning, then you just want to get through some of these gimmick missions as fast as possible, sometimes without even finishing them because they just waste your time that much. And that's just because they expect you to do, basically as Simon says, like, do this at this time. And yeah, of course, as I said several times, I'm not a great player. So, of course, there's probably ways to do it that I didn't consider or that I wasn't aware of. But when it's designed with trial and error in mind, a lot of the missions were, in this case, you're not going to be having a great time if you're expecting emergent gameplay that's organic, that's built around the mechanics. Like, a lot of this stuff used these concepts that we've praised and we've said are good and we've said can be used well. They're very least they're sound. Like, there's nothing immediately wrong with them when you look at them as concepts, but the execution in a lot of these missions was just really something to fucking behold. Like, it was pretty bad in some cases. There were some missions that were really bad.
For most of the micromaps, if not for all of them, I would say. And it's also funny as many of the micromaps, if memory serves, actually were also maps featuring timers. Whereas
of course,
most of the macromaps did not really feature timers, which is pretty interesting. That's one way to make the micromaps even worse. So, like, I can see why you would want to experiment with all the new tools you have in the engine, where you can use scripts to create a more impressive story, I guess. Not impressive in the sense of it being amazing, but in the sense of it being more present in the actual levels with the dialogue on transmissions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this doesn't mean that you have to sacrifice micro gameplay, which is unfortunately what many people think to be the case. Not just in this franchise, but in general. And if anyone has watched the playthrough, they will obviously understand this. They will have seen how so many of the micromaps could easily have had base building. And a few of them, in fact, did, where you were supposed to capture the enemy base and then attack another base. But most of them didn't, unfortunately. So that's really, like, they could have had the same themes, the same ideas, like you have to capture this guy so you can infiltrate the ion cannon network or whatever it was in the final node segment for the original game, or you want to chase down this person who's escaping on a train. But you can do that without having to resort to micro, basically. That's the main point.
Yeah, I mean, you can do that without resorting to QTE stuff, and you could just have that be an additional objective in addition to subduing the enemy forces through whatever way you normally did. Also, the fact that they still didn't learn to not make me hunt down every last fucking laser turret and fence wall and shit. Like, why? Why was that a thing? Just an aside, obviously, but seriously.
The problem is that it's not consistent in that we've seen it, at least in the previous game, and I think in this one too, at least a few times. Whereas if you destroy key structures, then the enemy just sells everything. And then you win because they have no more structures on the map. But it doesn't happen every time for some reason. It's just not consistent between missions. It's like they forgot to turn it off for some of the missions. It just seems like a bug almost.
Yeah, it sounds like it's one of those things where one person made this mission and they have a certain design philosophy, and then another level designer made the others, and it's one of those things that it's clearly not a very consistent vision. That's at least not by what we can reverse engineer from playing the product.
Definitely. And well, for the most part, one discussion, the actual missions, which of course is most of the experience we had, and I think what we can take away is that it wasn't really large scale for the most part. Most of the missions were fairly small to medium sized. There were a few big ones where you had to destroy several enemy bases, and there were even a few where you had like two enemy factions fighting with each other. In the Node campaign, there was a rogue general who was trying to steal the Tacitus, and you had to fight both that and GDI. But at the same time, it feels like for one thing they should have used different player colors for the AIs. Like, that is something they already didn't do in Red Alert 1, and they really should have started doing it here, which for the most part they never do. And there's also like, well, I mean, this leads to the issue where you're not sure what units belong to what player. So you, for example, you are going to shut down the power supply of one player, but then it will not shut down the defenses that you think it does, as it shuts down the defenses of some other place. I think we actually had this very issue in the last mission we played, the last Not Firestorm mission, where you destroyed a bunch of bases all around the map, but then you had a enemy base that used the same exact color that was stealthed, which was right in front of your base.
Yeah.
And so that's just poor, gameplay communication. It's just not very readable if they're going to use the same color. Then you just have trouble understanding who's who.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's definitely an issue that is extremely easy to solve. It's not like the engine isn't capable of doing it. It's literally just changing one line on the map file. That's all it takes. Unfortunately, it's not something that was done very often. And otherwise, I think for the most part, the missions, like you said, were fairly easy. They were not very challenging, but I think most of the pure macro maps were fine. Otherwise, they're nothing special, but at least playable and with way better controls than we've seen from the previous titles. And for example, they didn't really, for the most part, utilize the attack the harvester and suicide your entire army into your base, which is what they did in Red Alert 1. So at least that's an improvement there. And beyond this, I don't know if you have anything to add on this particular topic. Otherwise, we can discuss another element of the game, which is interesting, which is the fact that you can basically modify the units and the structures on a map basis. And this is something that we saw in action in the few missions where we were fighting the mutants. So the mutants do not have a tech tree of their own. We actually faced off against them twice. Once in the original game and once in the expansion. And it was a very different experience in both cases, as in the first game, they were actually using civilian vehicles with weapons added on them, which isn't something that is present in the actual game files. It's something that they literally changed in the map file itself. Anyone can do that.
Right.
So while that's a nice engine feature to have to make your maps moddable as much as possible, that's always nice. But I definitely think that in this case they should have probably focused more on creating an actual mutant faction, which apparently, according to Daniel Keaton, they actually wanted to do, but eventually ended up cutting from the game, probably due to time constraints or publishing constraints or whatever. But it does make the missions featuring them feel like it's unfinished, basically.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It's not, not using the features that it should use. Whereas at least the Firestorm mission was a bit better in that they actually had a war factor, even if it was the GDI one, and they were producing the Mammoth tanks and a couple other unique units like the unique infantry they have. So that, even though if they recycled buildings there, it at least feels a lot more organic, a lot more like they were an actual faction with an actual AI and stuff, as opposed to the mission where we fought them in the original game. And I will say this is something that's used quite a few times. Like, for example, you had the riot troopers in the one mission where you're supposed to subdue the riot leaders. Those units later show up in the Node campaign as the elite cadres, I believe, and they use exactly the same graphic. Because they're basically the same unit, just modified. So, like I said, it's an interesting engine mechanic, but not something that's at the same time, it feels like, especially for an official product, it's something that should have been accompanied, basically teamed up with actual new assets.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, what it reminded me of is all of those Brood War and Warcraft 3 quote-unquote conversions or whatever that, or just include like new races or new factions, and it's just like renamed instead of like if you click on the unit, it has a different name instead of having a different graphic. And stuff like that. So it felt very amateurish, and a lot of Firestorm felt very amateurish. Ironically enough, the cutscenes had more effort put into them than the base games. At least you can say that based on how long they were. But that's just in terms of executing like the scripts or whatever. The scripts were pretty much just as bad. So you had very little, proper. The story was just like a eye roll the entire time. And at that point, of course, you're not going to be invested in these really, really long cutscenes that don't engage with you anyways. I know Mesk and a few other people have different opinions on long cutscenes than we do, where I think we're both in agreement that the shorter the better, as long as you're still giving the player the proper information. But
especially as long as you're not interrupting gameplay.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Which, thankfully, for the most part, didn't actually happen here.
Yeah, that's definitely an extra stipulation to add. They didn't interrupt gameplay with cutscenes. This is something that happens in Brood War, in Warcraft 3, in StarCraft 2, and all of the other RTS games that I've played pretty much aside from the Command and Conquer games. Of course, there's like that one notable exception in Red Alert 1 where they talk about nukes or something halfway through the mission.
Yeah.
But aside from that, like this has a near flawless track record in that department. It's just that the cutscenes themselves are very fucking boring, and they took so long, especially in Firestorm, and they don't engage with you whatsoever. And this is one of the reasons why I brought up Mesk and those other people who have the opinion that cutscenes can be fine if they are long, as long as they are engaging you the entire way through, and it doesn't feel like it's a long time because there's proper voice acting, like it's done well in that case. The choreography is good. You're not bored watching it. Essentially, it's sort of like how you would rate a movie or a TV show or something. Like if you fall asleep halfway through, then it's stupid and should be redone in some way. But at least in the context of a video game, I feel like there is a certain point where it becomes too long, and that does depend on how engaging the base piece is. But in this case, like even 2 minutes was too long. And when you compare that to the briefings that I've had to narrate in my runs of StarCraft campaigns, those are actually more engaging than the stuff that we played here, that we watched here. You had the benefit of watching it without sound, which must have made it even more compelling, I'm sure. But yeah, suffice it to say, man, if you thought I was going to not bring those up in the review, you were sorely mistaken. Those cutscenes
that's fine.
were terrible.
It's just obviously not something I can comment
on.
Yeah. I recently did rewatch some of the Flame Knives videos because I ate it myself. And the briefings there are like 10 minutes long or something. I don't know why you
Yeah, well, it really goes to show, like, I didn't skip Flame Knives briefings, and I wanted to skip Flame Knives briefings less than I wanted to skip these cutscenes. I'll put it to you that way, man. So I don't know if that's because these were objectively worse to that point, or if it's because I personally was so fucking fed up with time wasted as a result of like sitting through all the Flame Knives. I don't know. I don't know what the actual root cause is. I'm not a psychiatrist, man. But I gotta tell you,
I think the reason is just that at this point we've seen enough, so we just want to get on with the fucking gameplay instead of whatever anime they have going. That's basically
At least with Flame Knives, I mean, you were getting some new anime. Like, it was a lot of rehashing, but at the end of the day, you came away with some gem of dialogue that was just impenetrable in its quality. Everlasting, evergreen. But in the case of the Command and Conquer stuff, like, most of it was just rehashing existing information, and on top of it, had nothing to do with what you were actually playing in the next minute. So you always had to open up the fucking objectives menu, which takes like 3 or 4 different clicks, and of course breaks C&C draw. And so it was just a disaster, man. It really, really was something to behold. Like, those cutscenes are a great example of what not to do with video game cutscenes. And it was so much budget. Like, if you are a game developer, that is the worst thing you can do, is sink a lot of your budget into set design, paying actors, paying the sound crew, paying the post-processing and video editors, and then to actually get them in, obviously you have to pay the scriptwriter and everything else, you get them in, and they don't even do their fucking job as a mission briefing. Like, why did you even do it? It's like a waste of money and your time, and the player's time. You wasted everybody's time and money. Good job, man.
Yeah, pretty much. They should strictly be tied to what's going on in the game, and oftentimes they're not. You have to open the briefing to do that.
Right. I mean, like, I'm the first one to say.
That's something they changed in some mods. For example, in the most popular Tiberian Sun mod, which is called Twisted Insurrection, they actually have a few cutscenes, but every time you launch a mission, you get a briefing before you actually get to the gameplay. So that's, again, something that should have been improved with just a few different codes changes, basically, and it just wasn't done for some reason. Yeah,
I don't know, man. I think if you look at the way that those cutscenes are, and you compare those to even like the Brood War briefings, and some of the expansion briefings in StarCraft get pretty long. Like, everybody remembers like the final briefing or whatever. That's sort of like, you can kind of see a pass on that because it's the last mission. But even some of the other ones, like the first Brood War Protoss mission, the first mission of the expansion, it's a pretty fucking long briefing, like 3-4 minutes. Like, that's pretty long for Brood War briefings. Obviously not by like Flame Knife standards or whatever, but for the vanilla game, it was pretty long.
Yeah, Flame Knives briefings start after the briefing is concluded. They just bring the briefing to the actual game screen for some.
Yeah.
Sometimes without even showing any graphics or anything. Just literally a black screen and transmissions coming through.
Don't remind me. I just wanted to make the point that like you can have these briefings still be somewhat engaging and still be topical. And I think one of the issues is like a lot of people want to tell a story, but they don't know how to do that in a game, let alone an RTS specifically. And so, of course, that they have the problems where the entire narrative falls apart, and like their cutscenes have nothing to do with what you're playing, and like you're telling a different story with your narrative devices than you are with your gameplay, which is like the primary way that I'm experiencing the story. Like to me, Cabal's a complete retard who can't control his units whatsoever, and like comes out as a giant mecha, and for some reason our cutscene shows him coming out when he's already halfway to my base, and like I still don't understand why that happened. That happened both times. It's like no quality assurance whatsoever, and like all this other stuff. Like all of the antagonists are completely incompetent because I'm bad and they can't even beat me. And like I know I'm playing on normal difficulty, but that's just because I want to avoid the damage multipliers, which we didn't even talk about yet. We probably won't really. I think that's enough to acknowledge their existence. Acknowledge.
Yeah.
But
they just prop up the health stuff, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's terrible.
As many games tend to do.
Yep. So, I don't know, man. It's bad. Like the fact that they were trying to tell a story in this way really hampered my appreciation for the title, because like I've said, like we both talked about in the beginning of the review, like the way that the environment comes to life tells its own kind of story. It really tells the story of the world. And like that is more compelling to me. The setting is more compelling to me than what they did with it in the actual execution of their concepts. Like that's what I wanted to drive home with that whole rant. But this all spiraled out from when we were talking about the fact that Firestorm had some rushed issues with it, which is why we didn't see a mutant campaign. And obviously this information is secondhand from Daniel Keaton, so I could be misquoting him or whatever. But that was at the very least, they wanted to have them be a proper race, and they weren't really a proper faction. They only had a couple of unique models, for example, or sprites. And so the art assets were lacking for them, and I think the unit variety was lacking for them. We didn't really touch too much on the unit variety of the factions themselves, but I feel like they were fine. They had very different strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, I remember Firestorm more than I remember the base game, but the base game had a lot of balance issues. Firestorm rebalanced some of the artillery and stuff, although it still made it kind of comical. Like, basically, they would just create giant terrain deformations everywhere instead of actually hitting their target if their target was moving. And that was kind of silly, because then they basically just rendered them almost completely inaccurate unless the unit was standing still, which, granted, it had to for most units anyways in order to fire. So it was bound to get some damage off at some point, unless they moved too close to them like siege tanks or something. But I guess one of the main issues that I have with the game is that a lot of the times where my units did something I didn't want them to do, I didn't feel like I was in control of telling them to not do that. And I think some of that comes down to the fact that I had to set them all into guard mode, and that gets overwritten when you move them or whatever. I think that's what happens anyways. And at least that's what it seemed like it was happening to me. And then, of course, all of the other issues with, what's it called? The various hotkeys that we only discovered partway through thanks to the stream. So, like, I don't know, maybe it was just a lack of knowledge on my part, but I did feel like there was almost no way to control the units in the way that I would want to.
I think it was a combination of lack of knowledge and especially poor communication on the developer's part. Like I said, maybe all of this is explained in the manual, which we didn't have, but it's definitely not explained in game. That's for sure.
Well, you'd think you would want to explain your mechanics in game for sure, but I don't know. I don't know how to feel exactly about Tiberian Sun, because, like I said, it has some good concepts. It has some concepts that I would actually take to even further degrees than they did in certain respects, like the environment being a living thing. Of course, I wouldn't take their terrain deformation rules, and I think it's even fine to have certain railgun type behaviors where terrain impacts projectiles and in different ways, or weapons in general in different ways. Having bouncing projectiles or whatever, that could be cool. Having stuff that attacks that do less damage when they have to shoot through terrain. Like maybe instead of railguns doing no damage to units that are on a higher or lower level than them, if the line that it's drawn has to go through terrain in order to hit the other unit, then it just takes reduced damage or something. Like I could see something like that happening, because these are ways where as long as they're consistent throughout the entire game, therefore not a gimmick, they do add some degree of positional gameplay that the player can then realize is consistent. Like it's a consistent amount of positional gameplay driven by these mechanics. I think that's fine. I think that can work. And whether or not players like that, they'll just decide whether or not they like it by themselves. And but at the very least, they'll know it's consistent, so they'll know that they can adapt to it. They can just not use those units if it doesn't fit their fancy or whatever. Yeah. And so I think that that's fine because I obviously opted out of all railgun units just in general because they were completely worthless for me because there was always so much terrain deformation in the campaign, not only because of artillery, but just the base levels were all designed that way. A lot of the resource areas as well were designed in ways that made it deliberately annoying for you to have to snake your way up there. And they still didn't fix the fucking expansion rules in this. You couldn't build MCVs half the time. That was pretty frustrating. I'm trying to like run through any lasting sort of things that I feel like we didn't hit, but I do feel like it was a pretty comprehensive takedown of many of the things. So
we explained most of the concepts, and like we overlooked a few things. Like for example, there's two different types of resource. There's green Tiberium and blue Tiberium.
That was new.
One of which is more profitable, but it's also explosive, so it can actually blow up.
Right.
If it's exposed to certain types of weapons, which is an interesting mechanic. And this is also reflected in the actual harvesters. I don't remember if we ever saw this in game, but if you actually load an harvester with blue Tiberium and it explodes, it sort of turns into a demolition truck, basically, as the Tiberium inside the harvester will violently explode and cause it to damage all units around it.
At least it's not a fucking nuclear truck.
Yeah. But yeah, I think overall, Tiberian Sun definitely had way too many micro maps. The macro maps were fine, I guess, for the most part, at least for the time. And I don't know, it just feels like it has its place, its history, but at the same time, it feels like we should have learned from its mistakes, but we still haven't, evidently.
Right, yeah,
at least in the game industry.
That was the final sort of discussion point I wanted to wrap things up with.
That's pretty much my takedown on it.
Yeah. No, I feel like a lot of the games that came after Tiberian Sun didn't learn very many lessons from it. But, I mean, I've been saying the same thing about Brood War. Brood War has been the de facto RTS for most people, especially in terms of, like, financial success. And nobody's tried to replicate that besides the devs of Armies of Exego. And those guys, they were rushed up the ass by Ubisoft, I think, and then they joined EA or something. They just got completely gangbanged by the industry later on. And they were also making a 3D RTS. It was all sorts of messy. It was a lot of development issues on launch, and so or before launch rather. And so we can't really look to that as a real proper hack at it. Like nobody really has given it another go. At that point, I think Brood War is just a glass ceiling. Like I'm waiting for people to shatter it, but nobody is. Nobody's willing to put in the effort, it seems. So you guys will have to wait until 2037 or whatever the fuck, because Jay Wilson, and that'll be when I finally release my RTS. So I hope you guys are going to be willing to check that out. But I mean, otherwise, I don't really know. I feel like Tiberian Sun, like you said, it has its place in history. It's got its niche. It's always going to appeal to the people who grew up with it, I think, for sure. It's a solid enough game. It's inoffensive when it's actually doing its macro. But it doesn't blow me away. It has some good concepts that were executed to varying degrees of success when they were actually used. Mostly failure, especially when it comes to the environmental stuff and the where I feel like they tried to make them take too much space in the execution of the game, where you had to think about those extra mechanics that felt more gimmicky because they were taking up so much space in your head, like because you had to think about them so much in the context of the mission. I definitely feel like they felt more like gimmicks than they should have, considering they were built into the baseline mechanics of the game. They just weren't used very frequently, and when they were used, it was like, hey, look at this gimmick, look, pay attention. And instead of it just being like silently there and affording you a certain amount of just understanding of like, hey, things are going to be different, you're going to have to adapt to this, but it's something that's simple enough to grasp and built into the base mechanics of the game, as it should be, and so it shouldn't really be that big of a deal. But instead it was like mission failure, like mission is over if you don't take this into account, instead of just it being another tool to use or another thing you have to adapt to. So I definitely feel like a lot of them became tantamount to gimmicks, even if they weren't actually gimmicks on a mechanical level. It's just that were used in those ways. It would be like if you made a StarCraft map and you for the entire campaign up until this point, you couldn't build a certain unit, and then you enable that unit, and that unit is the only unit that can really do any damage to the enemy. It's like, oh, well, yeah, that unit might be in the base game, and it might not actually be a gimmick to use that unit for the way most people do, but the way that you used it here made it a gimmick, and that's kind of how they did that. They built the maps around these not really new mechanics, like they were new to this game, but they weren't new to the player. The player had already experienced them to some degree beforehand, and they just said, hey, focus all your attention on this mechanic. And that made it a gimmick in that sense. So I felt that that was a real disappointing usage of these concepts that are otherwise, when you just look at them on paper, you try to be objective about them. I can't see a problem with them. I just see a problem with their execution, like the way that they were deployed. And I think that you can abstract that sort of line of logic and take it to most of the elements of this game that weren't as satisfactory as they ought to have been. And of course, I do want to close out by mentioning that the pathfinding of the harvesters was still kind of fucking annoying. But hopefully they fix those in Red Alert 2. Hopefully they fix a lot of the issues that I mentioned in Red Alert 2. And we will eventually be getting to that sometime, maybe next month. We'll see.
We'll see, definitely. I think that pretty much closes the review. We may or may not come back to this game when it comes to checking out its vibrant modding scene. But yeah, otherwise, for now, that's the end for Tiberian Sun. And I hope you guys have enjoyed the playthrough. I hope you've enjoyed the review. And we'll see you when it comes to Red Alert 2 and other RTS games in the future.
Bye!
Bye-bye.